Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Taking Action, Assisting Victims of Financial Fraud. And it's a 2.0 webinar because we've just recently developed a new Taking Action guide or an updated Taking Action guide. So we've got some new information and resources in our publication and wanted to share with you some of that new information here today. My name is Laura Cook. I am the director of the Financial Crime Resource Center, which is a program of the National Center for Victims of Crime. National Center got started out of one family's tragedy. Back in 1985, Sunny von Bulow, some of you guys may be a little bit familiar with this story. She was, her husband attempted to murder her. And unfortunately, through a series of events, he was prosecuted and he was convicted, but his prosecution or his conviction was overturned. His family felt incredibly re-victimized through this process, or Sunny's family rather, her children especially, feeling like they didn't have a voice. They started the National Center back in 1985. Motivated by their mother's victimization and the family's traumatic experience with the criminal justice system. So the founders believed it was fundamentally wrong that crime victims were shut out of the system and re-victimized by the very system that was supposed to help them. They established the National Center hoping to redefine what justice for crime victims means by giving them a voice in the system. So our mission generally is to forge a national commitment to help victims of crime rebuild their lives. And we do this by advocating for stronger rights, protections, and services for victims, doing a lot of training, education, and evaluation, and also serving as a source of information on victims' issues. I want to talk a little bit about the National Compassion Fund. It's one of our other programs. The Compassion Fund, basically we started the Compassion Fund because we unfortunately see a lot of mass shootings. And what happens after those mass shootings is that lots of people do want to reach out and help in whatever way they can, many ways by donating. Sometimes there are fake GoFundMes that we see. We've been seeing a fair amount of fundraiser fraud. And so we started this Compassion Fund to have one place where people can donate, where they know that 100% of those proceeds will be distributed to victims. So we've helped with many of the more recent mass shootings in Las Vegas, at Major Eastern and Douglas School in Florida. We're currently helping with the Santa Fe one right now as well. And like I said, one of the reasons we do include this is to notify people about fundraising fraud, one of the many different types of fraud we'll talk about a lot today. A lot of different kinds of fraud, but fundraising fraud is one that we do often see in the wake of tragedies, and it's something to look out for. The Financial Crime Resource Center is another program of the National Center, and our goal is to improve outcomes for financial fraud victims by emphasizing their recovery, using victim-affirming and centered approaches, and developing resources that are easy to use.
Yep, that's good.
We partner with many organizations around the U.S. who work with victims of fraud, and we basically want to help victims regain control of their lives after this fraud has occurred. With me today, I have one of my good colleagues, Susan Arthur, who works at the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, and I'll turn the presentation over to her to tell you a little bit about FINRA and a little bit about what they do, and then start talking about financial fraud.
Foundation, and I manage our investor protection campaign. And really, our overarching strategy is to train fraud fighters, intermediaries such as you folks, victim service providers, law enforcement, to carry our prevention messages and resources into their respective communities. What's important to note is that we are grounded in research. Since the foundation was started, we have done lots of research to really look at the face of financial fraud. And why is it that some people are more prone to falling victim to fraud than others, and what is that victimology that supports that? And then also, how do the scammers operate? What's behind?
Oh, okay. We were looking for that one. That's all semester, because we were looking for that one.
Okay.
And we're like, we see there's a
Sorry, everyone. We're getting a good deal of background noise right now, and we don't know where it's coming from. If you are attending this webinar right now and are speaking, we might be able to hear you. That's not supposed to happen. That's a problem on our end, and I apologize for that. But if you all the attendees could try to mute their microphones, particularly if there's noise around you, that would be helpful until we get this figured out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. And so in addition to research and really understanding why is it that certain people fall victim and how do the scammers operate, we also could not do what we do without our many different partnerships across the country. We've got terrific partners who we work with, such as the National Center for Victims of Crime, and we developed the resource guide together that this webinar is based on. We also do law enforcement trainings with the National White Collar Crime Center. We work with the AARP Foundation and now their fraud network to conduct proactive outreach through their call centers with prevention messages and resources. So that's just a variety of the types of partnerships that we have. The Better Business Bureau, we train their affiliates across the country. And we are always open to new ideas for how we can work with folks, whether you be national, state, or local organizations, to help ameliorate this whole area of financial fraud. Lastly, what I think is important to note is we are really, it's important to us to train consumers as best we can to understand that we all are vulnerable at certain points in our lives. And why that is important is because scammers are really clever at determining what the hot buttons are of individuals and their vulnerabilities. So we want folks to be aware of that, to also understand that scammers use persuasion to reel their victims in. And persuasion really is nothing more than the use of what I would call advertising and sales tactics. So the use of persuasion is how the scammers work. They build on our emotion. So what's really important for all of us is to, our little tagline is ask and check. Ask lots of questions of anybody who's trying to sell you something, and then go and check out their answers, because anything they're trying to sell you today will be there tomorrow. So moving right along, what we wanted to do with this guide is to divide it up into different sections. The first section really is covers a few factoids from the foundation research that we've conducted, and then we look into the role the victim can play, as well as your role as an advocate, and what are those action steps that you can follow. And then, of course, we go over lots of different resources. As you may have seen in the guide, we have divided it into 4 broad categories of financial fraud. The first, of course, is identity theft. The second, investment fraud, mortgage and lending fraud, and then, of course, mass marketing and other frauds. And Laura, you can move right along to the next one. Okay, and on this next chart, after these major categories, is really just a summary via graphic format of what I just reviewed with you earlier. The way that we believe we can protect consumers from fraud is to understand more about the victimology. What is that victim profile that makes someone more potentially vulnerable to falling victim, and also becoming re-victimized. We look at the risky behaviors, as well as, and I think this one block is very important, psychological biases. We all have what I would call those influencers, both innate and external, that impact our decision making. So it's always important to remember that when we're making financial decisions in particular. the susceptibility and the individual differences of people, and then, of course, the impact of self-reporting error that I will get into on the next slide, or in a couple of slides. I included this graph because I think it's very apropos for talking about persuasion. And this graph essentially shows the results of a control group that we work with through research, and we showed them a sample fraud pitch using persuasion, of course, and guaranteeing or suggesting returns of 110% a year. And believe it or not, 42% of the respondents who heard this sample fraud pitch, not knowing, of course, that it was fraudulent, thought that this was very appealing. And that's, in my mind, very alarming because, of course, this day and age, if you hear 5%, that might be a good thing. Close to 10, 110%, I don't think so. So, and of course, this chart and this study was done back in 2013, and we're working on upgrading it. At that time, 9+% was more realistic. That's probably gone down a little since then. So it just shows you that the people who were hearing this were susceptible to the use of persuasion. And what happens when you're susceptible is your brain moves from making a thoughtful and rational decision to becoming more in an emotional state, or what we would call under the ether. Your heart starts to race, you're thinking it sounds too good to be true, and that is how the scammers potentially can get you to sign on the dotted line. So moving right along, unfortunately, as Laura said, that little picture before was just a video of how fraud happens in the movies. And if you've never seen the movie The Boiler Room, I would suggest that you watch it, only because this is a very old movie and it's classic, and it's still how fraud can occur today. And then this next slide is really just a combination of different factoids from research that we've learned, such as we've learned that more than 8 in 10 have received a potentially fraudulent offer. This comes from a susceptibility study in 2013, so my guess is that number has gone up. We estimate that up to $50 billion a year is lost to financial fraud. And what's really important to note about this is that there's a great deal of underreporting with financial fraud, and I'm sure you can guess why. The major reason is people are too embarrassed to come forward. But in addition to that, what we've learned is they don't know where to turn, and they don't think it would make a difference. And all of that couldn't be further from the truth. Thus, one thing I would point out is that is why it's so important to work with you folks, law enforcement, to inform you as to the resources that we have to better equip you if you come across someone who believes they may have fallen victim to financial fraud, and to encourage them to report to you or to the proper authorities what has happened to them. Lastly, this factoid is Americans aged 65 and older are more likely to be targeted, 34% more likely to lose money than those respondents in their 40s. And I don't think this is a big surprise because, of course, scammers go where the money is, and older Americans would be a more likely target because they've earned and saved more money than younger folks. Now, the chart on the right-hand side is what we would call the non-traditional costs of financial fraud. And, of course, the consequences of fraud are not just financial. There are real and lasting social and emotional consequences. And, of course, they include stress, anxiety, depression, and potentially a suicide, which is unfortunate. And the sad thing with financial fraud is you cannot necessarily see the impact, such as a physical type of abuse, but it's no less devastating.
So as Susan indicated, the research has told us a lot about victims and a lot about profiles. And like she said, older adults are often more targeted and sometimes are more susceptible to falling victim. But the one thing we want you to remember is that anybody can be a victim of financial fraud, truly anybody. Most of us probably have been. Most of us have probably experienced in the least, those annoyances with somebody hacking into a bank account or something like that. And hopefully no one has experienced anything too devastating. But it's so rampant and widespread. And with the technological innovations, the more technological innovations we have, the more scammers use those to exploit us. And so I'm sure perpetrators will be finding new ways to target people as advances in technology continue. So anybody can definitely be a victim. And what we do find is that victim profiles vary a little bit by scam. So with investment fraud, we find that victims are often male, financially literate, college educating, and approaching or in retirement. Because like Susan said, that's where the money is. They're coming into retirement savings, and they're often more likely to fall for those investment schemes. They might, when they're retiring, they're trying to figure out something to do with all the savings they're coming into, and investment sounds like a good opportunity, and often fraudsters use that to target victims. Conversely, we see lottery fraud and other types of mass marketing fraud targeting single older consumers and those that have lower levels of education and income. So these are things people are getting in the mail. So it might be an older person who lives alone, and they're taking typically smaller amounts of money through these types of scams. Lastly, we see many mass marketing scams targeting younger adults as well. We see a lot of 18-year-olds going to college, getting bank accounts for the first time, and we're seeing email phishing scams targeting them, saying, "Hey, this is your bank. We need you to email us your Social Security card or your Social Security number. There's a problem with your account." And because they've never had a bank account number, they have no reason to believe that's fraudulent and will often send it, and then will find themselves victims of identity theft or other types of mass marketing fraud. In addition, research shows that there are a number of high target populations. So again, we start with seniors. From 2012 to 2014, complaints from those over 65 to the FTC went up by 47%. So a significant increase. And it's for a number of reasons. Older adults may be dependent on others for their care. There may be physical impairments. They may have cognitive or age-related mental capacity issues like dementia, Alzheimer's, or other types of dementia. They also might be grieving loved ones. We find that perpetrators target people who have suffered a loss, particularly widows and widowers, because they are more vulnerable. Near retirees are targeted because they're coming into their retirement savings. And older adults just generally hold the wealth. So if you're a perpetrator of financial fraud, trying to figure out who to target, it seems to make the most sense to target those who are vulnerable and have the most money. We expect this to increase, or this increase to keep increasing, because every 8 seconds an American turns 65. So the older generation is expanding. I think we've got 10,000 people turning 65 each day. And one last reason to note is that as cognition declines, financial skills are often the first to go. So we like to talk about different parts of the brain and how they work. Often what goes first is your frontal lobe and higher thinking processes, and what we like to kind of call our bullshit detector. It doesn't work after a certain age as well as it worked when we were younger. And so when perpetrators use those red flag things that make financial fraud seem like such a great investment opportunity, those red flags are not raised when we're older as quickly as they might be when we're younger. Another population that is often targeted are victims of domestic violence. Identity theft is a form of economic abuse. It's also a form of surveillance, so we might see it in stalking cases. Additionally, in a survey of identity theft victims, 15% reported that they were also victims of domestic harassment and abuse from the perpetrator. So we definitely see a big overlap in this area. Lastly, one high target population is previous victims. Victims, those who have fallen victims of financial fraud are likely to fall victim again, first because their information is out there. Somebody has used the Social Security number or other personal identifying information to commit a fraud. That information is out there and may well be used again. In addition, previous victims who have lost money might be looking for an opportunity to recover it, and thus might be a little bit more vulnerable to additional scams. So moving on to what we know about the perpetrators. Perpetrators, again, can be anybody, but we do see trends. For example, in elder abuse cases, I'm not just talking about elder financial exploitation, but generally with elder abuse, we often see that it's people the victim knows and trusts. So family members, friends, caregivers, attorneys, doctors, nurses, all those different people who are working with the older adult. Because we see that in elder abuse cases, we also often see it in elder financial exploitation cases, that the perpetrators are people the victim knows and trusts. Additionally, members of a victim's or leaders of a victim's affinity groups. Perpetrators will often target an affinity group, like a church group. Once they are able to convince one person in that affinity group that this investment or giving them money for any purpose is a good idea, it can make it a little bit easier to convince others in that group. So if you are able to convince John and Jane Doe to give you $20,000 for an investment opportunity, tell them to go back to their affinity group and tell the others in their friend groups about this investment opportunity. What we then see is others in that group also being interested in potentially falling victim. Trusted advisors can often be perpetrators, particularly financial advisors and people in those relationships with victims. And then strangers. Strangers can also be perpetrators of financial fraud, particularly with mass marketing fraud. Most mass marketing fraud is committed by strangers, people that have never encountered the victims, and often people who aren't even living in the same vicinity or even country as the victim. So Susan, I'll turn it back to you to talk a little bit about how the frauds are perpetrated.
Thanks, Laura. So as it says here, fraudsters use emotion. You've heard me talk a little bit about persuasion. So through the use of persuasion tactics and working on an individual by incorporating emotion, sometimes it's really hard to move out from under the ether, so to speak. So how do they do this? So think about compassion. These are messages that appeal to the heart. What comes to mind for me, of course, is the grandmother scam. And I can say from my own experience, my mother fortunately did not fall for the scam, but she got a call supposedly from her grandson, my nephew, Bobby, who lives in California. My mom is in a small town in Virginia. And while she didn't think it really sounded like him, he had all the information about Bobby, whomever this person was that was calling, and knew where he went to school, knew his friends. My nephew Bobby had a great friend who he went to college with that was from Colombia. And Bobby says they're in Colombia to attend his friend Santi's mother's funeral. And they needed money. Evidently, the rental car they had, there were drugs in the trunk, and they got pulled over by the police. So they needed money for court fees, several $1,000s, I might add. And so that's a long way of saying you can imagine, though, it really played on my mother's heartstrings, even though she knew deep down inside that, of course, this was a fraud. She knows what I do for a living. But think about that. And also, it's a combination of compassion with fear. And fear, of course, are messages that scare us into action. So you can understand why that particular scam has been successful somewhat. And, of course, in terms of fear, the IRS, that's a big one with them. They potentially say they're standing outside your door and they're going to come arrest you. And if potential victims are living alone, you can imagine how that might scare someone into action. And then lastly, Laura talked about affinity. And, of course, affinity is a tough one because these are messages that appeal to the need for all of us to belong. And, of course, affinity groups are such as our religious organizations, the military, civic-minded people and organizations. And I can completely understand how it would be tough if you're in, for instance, a religious group and one of your very close friends whom you trust says they think that you should buy into this particular product or offering because they think it's really good and going to increase in value. That would be tough. But we do have steps that we encourage folks to take. As I went over earlier, just slow down the decision making and ask questions and check the answers, even if it is from a friend, because at the end of the day, it's not your friend's money, it's yours. So moving along, in addition to emotion, of course, they use psychology. You heard me talk a little bit about what we call biases. And biases are what I would say are influencers, those external influencers, and also innate influences that impact our own decision making. And so innate influencers might be as a result of the culture in which we're raised, the way our parents raised us, and any other strong beliefs from our background that potentially could influence a financial decision making. And then external biases are real. There are any number of them. And the one I like to always chat about is what we call choice overload. And you all know what that is. There are just too many choices for every decision we have to make. And honestly, if there are too many decisions, we potentially, it wears us down. We may not make the quality decision that we need to make. So these are all things that are important to point out to folks before they ever hand over their hard-earned money. And the last thing I'll say about this slide is a couple years ago, the Center Foundation developed this documentary that you see on the slide, Thinking Money, the Psychology Behind Our Best and Worst Financial Decisions. And I would encourage everybody to watch it because through the use of subject matter experts, we talk about these biases, the psychology behind how we make our own decisions and how that parlays into scammers and how they get us to hand over our money as well. So we've talked about emotion and biases, and what you're looking at now is how fraud happens, and these are those persuasion tactics that I've talked about a little earlier. What we've learned from research is that depending on the type of financial fraud, there might be a handful of tactics that are used. What we learned with investment fraud in particular is it takes a little longer for investment fraud for the pitch to work. There's typically an individual involved, unlike if it's a phishing type of scam, for instance. And so the average number of tactics used for investment fraud is 13. However, these are the top 5, and I would say that it's really not important to remember their names as much as it is to understand that all of these tactics can potentially impact and make our hearts start beating just a little bit faster. And what that would essentially mean is when that scammer is talking to you and they're incorporating these tactics and your heart starts to race, then you have moved from making a rational decision to an emotional one because it's the emotion that's making your heart race. So let's look quickly at these different tactics. Phantom riches. I like to call that the Bernie Madoff special. He, of course, guaranteed for his fictitious product that potential investors would get 9% across the board, regardless of market performance. And, of course, phantom riches essentially just means it's the dangling of the prospect of wealth that's really not there. It's not real. And that's why it's called phantom riches. And I would say that the tagline that goes along with this most specifically is, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. We've all heard that, and that really applies to phantom riches. Moving over to the right, source credibility. And this is one of those tactics that's ingrained in all of us. We all want to deal with professionals depending on the type of decision we have to make. If you're going to get your knee operated on, you're not going to go to a dentist. You're going to do the research that you need to do, and you're going to select an orthopedic surgeon. The other side of the coin for source credibility, though, is that it can be faked. It's very easy nowadays to print diplomas off of the internet, rent that corner office, print some celebrity photos and hang them on your wall, and voila, there you go. You are the professional that you say that you are, when in fact you really are not. Over the bottom left hand, at the bottom, social consensus. This is the tactic that's most closely aligned with affinity frauds. And, you know, really, I would say the tagline that goes along with it is, if everybody's doing it, it must be good. And, of course, it's really easy to get hung up with that, especially if they're your friends or your family and they're suggesting something to you. But at the end of the day, it's really important to point out to folks that it's their money that they've worked years to save, and so it's important to take the due diligence and the steps involved to do your homework before you sign on the dotted line. The bottom tactic, reciprocity. This is another one of those tactics that I would say is ingrained in us from a very early age. And what I mean by that is, if you're invited to someone's house for lunch or dinner, more than likely we're going to reciprocate by taking flowers, maybe a dessert, maybe a bottle of wine, whatever. But we're reciprocating because of this nice invitation that we received. So normally if I could see you folks in person, I would ask for a raise of hands as to how many of you have ever received those free lunch and dinner seminar invitations. And so the only reason we point that out is reciprocity is at play with those invitations, and it's quite possible that they could all be a scam. Now, we're not suggesting that they all are. I misspoke in that regard. But it's very important to proceed with much caution. If you really want to go to Ruth Chris's Steakhouse for a really nice dinner, then have at it. But do not answer the call when they call you a week later and want to send you the materials that are related to that, the reason why you went to the free dinner in the first place. Because what happens is, if it is a scam, and you went to this restaurant that you've never gone to because it's so expensive and you didn't have to pay anything, and then all of a sudden they call you back after you've had this lovely dinner, reciprocity just might kick in, and you just might be thinking, oh, well, what's the harm in that? Sure, go ahead, send it to me. Then they have all of your contact information, and they will be relentless in terms of following up with contact to you. So that's reciprocity, and we end with scarcity, which is typically that tactic that's used at the close of the deal. And we're all familiar with scarcity as well. It's time or product scarcity. So, for instance, you know, you go and you want to buy this particular item, and they say it's half price today, but tomorrow it doubles in price. It goes back to the original. So you better get it today. Or they might say, this is the last one in stock at this price. So we all are very familiar with how scarcity works. So those are the top 5 tactics, and it's how the scammers operate. And the only thing I'll say about this, because we're not showing videos, this is a parody on America's Favorite Pastime. I would encourage you watch it if you've never seen it before. You can Google Smart Shopping Network, and then you can find it online, and hopefully you'll enjoy it as well. But at the end of that particular video is this slide here, and it's the use of all of those tactics that I just reviewed. And essentially what it is, it's a parody on the home shopping networks, who, by the way, are very successful at what they do because they're incorporating all of these tactics, and together, voila, they get a lot of people to call in and buy whatever product is that they're selling. So, for instance, on this particular video, we were selling the shims that you see in the picture. Normally they're $200, but for you out there in TV land, you get them for $49.90. So that's the use of reciprocity. And then the purple circle is, of course, the use of social consensus. And as the number goes up, in combination with the yellow circles, which are scarcity, you know, as they get sold out and the timer goes down, you can see how if someone's in a more vulnerable state and the emotion kicks in, that's why the home shopping networks legitimately are very successful. And that's how the scammers operate. This next slide is just a visual for you to see. I talked a little earlier about how with investment fraud, on average, the scammer uses about 13 tactics. So this is different types of financial fraud and how many tactics on average are at play to get a potential victim to fall for whatever it is that they're selling. Not really important to remember other than just it's the use of that persuasion that moves an individual to that emotional state. Thanks, Laura. Oh, I think I'm still on. Sorry about that. All right, so or is it you? Yeah, it's you.
Yeah, that's me. Sorry, Susan. I was just unmuting myself.
We're not together, as you can tell.
And so I'm going to move on and talk to you all about a little bit about a victim-centered approach. This is something that we felt really strongly about including in the Taking Action Guide because we found that a lot of people, when you first start talking about financial fraud, you know, particularly in comparison to what many victim advocates see and deal with every day in their jobs, it's just taken a little bit less seriously than other types of more violent crime. But we want to make sure that people are taking the same approaches as they would to assisting victims of other types of crime. And those approaches include a couple of things, including a trauma-informed response, setting the victim's expectations, and building collaborations. A trauma-informed response is just making sure that all the interactions and everything you're doing with victims is grounded in an understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma, and emphasizes psychological, physical, and emotional safety, and creates opportunities for victims to rebuild their sense of control. Probably most importantly, in my opinion, is setting expectations for victims. We want to make sure we're realistic and that they understand what resources are available to them and what exactly those resources do. We have a helpline here in our office called the Victim Connect Resource Center, and basically that helpline is for providing resources and referrals to victims. We get so many calls of people thinking this is like the last line or the last person that they need to talk to, and it's the end-all be-all, and that we can help them with every issue we're having, without understanding that it's simply a resource and referral line to get them hopefully connected to the best resources they have available. So when we give victims resources, we want to make sure to explain, do a good job of explaining what those are and what they do, so that when they make those phone calls, they know what to expect. Lastly, we emphasize building collaborations because we've found and research has indicated that things like multidisciplinary teams work so well, and that the more we collaborate and work together, the better and more holistic the responses typically are. So in order to provide a trauma-informed response, we have to know a little bit about trauma. Everyone has this own fluctuating equilibrium of balancing stress in their daily life, and trauma just simply throws off that individual's equilibrium. The main thing to get out of this information is just that everybody's trauma thresholds are very unique, and it can be affected by many, many things. Trauma is simply a uniquely disruptive event that's beyond, that strains one's capacity beyond what is typical and exceeds their normal ability to adapt and change. Financial victimization can be traumatic if it's unique and disruptive enough to make it difficult for victims to reestablish their normal equilibrium. During this slide, we often give the analogy of a state of emergency. Years back, there was a helicopter crash in Virginia. It crashed into a residential area, caused damages and significant. I think there were some casualties and injured people, and it was a large tragedy. However, Virginia had a lot of resources and was able to respond to that event with the internal resources that they had. Conversely, we were traveling out of town to another state, a very small state in a rural area, and they had a tanker truck overturn and spill oil all over a main highway in that area. In that state, they actually had to declare a state of emergency because they did not have the resources in that state to deploy to address that problem without causing significant other issues. So it's trauma is kind of like an individual's own declaring a state of emergency. If somebody experiences a trauma, they need to bring in outside resources to help them cope with it. And you all, the victim advocates, law enforcement, mental health counselors, attorneys, financial industry professionals, whatever fields you may be in, you all are those external resources that they need to bring in when they declare their own state of emergency and need help to recover from a traumatic experience. And I've kind of already answered this question. Is financial victimization traumatic? Yes. So we always want people to think it can be. So it's not necessarily traumatic. You know, an identity theft that doesn't have an impact on a person's finances, like something the bank might reimburse, that is in most cases not going to be traumatic for anybody. However, there are scenarios where financial victimization can be very traumatic. An example we often give is an older adult who has lost all of their financial fraud to a person that they trusted, perhaps a caregiver. Not only is that fraud, being that it's a trusted person, that's going to take a big emotional impact on that victim. But in addition, if they have lost their life savings, that fraud is going to affect them every day for the rest of their lives. It's going to affect where they live, what they eat, what they're able to buy, and it will probably affect them for the rest of their lives. So in those cases, financial victimization probably will be traumatic. And Susan went over this little chart on the right-hand side a little bit earlier, talking about the emotional costs of fraud, or the non-financial costs of fraud. And as you can see, 2/3 do report some sort of non-financial cost to a serious degree, and it can range from stress, depression, anxiety, difficulty sleeping, to even post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So the Attorney General has some guidelines for victim and witness assistance because our responses really can dictate a victim's ability to recover. Trauma leaves victims with, lots and lots of reactions that, they don't know what to do, and it really makes people feel like they have lost control. And what we want to do is help them try to regain that control, or feel like they have been able to regain some control over their over their lives, whether it be something like a violent crime or something financial. The brain has different responses to trauma. It can range from a variety of emotions that you see up on your screen. There could be fear and terror, and these all can happen in response to a financial crime. So fear and terror, a lot of perpetrators, like Susan said earlier, will use fear and terror to perpetrate crimes. So, for instance, Susan used the grandparent scam, that fear that a loved one is in trouble. Even after you find that that loved one is not in trouble and that the victim may realize that it was a scam, those feelings of fear don't just dissipate. They still may remain even after the crime has occurred. Many people will feel angry, furious, outraged, confusion and frustration, often particularly in cases where the perpetrators are somebody the victim knows and trusts. We see a lot of guilt and self-blame in financial crime, and I think one of the reasons for that is because the victims are often somewhat active participants in their own victimization, and so immediately after they realize that what has happened was a financial scam, the first thing is, I can't believe I fell for this. And one of the things that we always try to reassure victims of is that this isn't uncommon. It happens to many people, and it is absolutely not your fault. Victims often feel shame and humiliation for those same reasons, and they may feel grief and sorrow. It may be a grieving of future plans, like the person whose life savings has gone. There may be some grief there. So a couple keys to providing a trauma-informed response, first and foremost, is to minimize re-victimization. We always want to assume that victims have a trauma history, and typically we don't have time, nor do we really need to go through and do a trauma inventory of any sort of traumatic things that a victim has gone through in their life. So we just always want to assume that people we're working with probably have dealt with something traumatic in the past, and considering that, want to do our best to minimize any re-victimization. We want to understand that trauma will affect perceptions of situations, intent, and trust. And so when we first start working with victims, they may be really hesitant to trust us, and that typically is the trauma talking. They've had their trust violated, or they've been through a traumatic experience that sort of distrust might project onto their relationship with somebody who is trying to help. We also definitely want to emphasize safety, physical, psychological, emotional, and even financial safety as well. And lastly, we want to create opportunities for them to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. We want them to participate in their recovery. So a brief mention of polyvictimization. So we talked about in the last slide, assume individuals have a trauma history. And the reason for this is because polyvictimization, when more than one traumatic event has occurred through a victim's life, it can compound the effects of trauma, just make them that much more likely that a victim will suffer from PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other sorts of traumatic effects. The key to preventing re-victimization, particularly when we're dealing with a victim of polyvictimization, is to provide them with legal assistance, case management, and counseling or access to mental health care. Okay, so moving on, this is kind of the meat of the Taking Action Guide, the action steps for advocates and action steps for victims. So we first start out with a couple action steps for advocates. There are 4 action steps that are the same regardless of the type of fraud. So the guide is laid out typically separating 4 major types of financial fraud that we went over early in the presentation. But these 4 action steps are going to be the same regardless of the type of financial crime. So first, safety planning, physical, psychological, emotional, and financial. We want to make sure people are safe. If possible, we might want to try to get them away from the perpetrator if the perpetrator is a family friend or somebody that they know. We also want to make sure that they have some sort of financial stability so that, if, for instance, in a domestic violence case, if they're living with a perpetrator, we can brainstorm with them and figure out a safety plan so that they could be financially stable if they need to get away from the perpetrator quickly. That's the sort of planning we need to do, and there are resources out there for that. Secondly, we want to refer victims to resources. Lots of resources out there, and we'll talk to you about all of those here shortly. Third, we want to refer them to mental health counselors. People might not right away be interested in seeking mental health treatment, but later on they may realize that they are suffering from some effects of trauma and may want to talk to somebody. So it's always good to give them that information at the outset so that they have it if and when they might need it. And then lastly, consider calling Adult Protective Services. If we're dealing with a vulnerable older adult, if we're dealing with an older adult or a younger vulnerable adult, Adult Protective Services may be able to provide additional assistance. We've got a little slide here on setting expectations. So as I said earlier, I think this is probably one of the most important things to talk to victims about. Typically when victims of financial fraud are starting recovery, the first thing they want to know is how can I get my money back? And sometimes we have to be the bearers of bad news and have to tell them that full financial recovery is difficult to achieve. But it's so important to tell them that from the outset rather than to give them a whole slew of resources and have them calling and making all those, doing all that outreach, thinking that those resources are going to be able to help them recover their finances. So you want to set that expectation and let them know what exactly those resources are for so that they know when they call people for help what exactly the help that they can receive might be. We want to let them know that recovery requires work. There's lots of resources, and in some cases, depending on how pervasive the fraud is, they might need to call many resources, might need to call many offices, and might need to do a lot of work to make sure they aren't re-victimized, to secure their accounts as much as they can, and to recover in other ways, and it can take a lot of time and effort. We do want to let them know that reporting matters. So sometimes a lot of the places that you report, they're not going to, it's not going to start a criminal investigation. It's not going to immediately get their money back, but it is so important because the organizations use data from reports to address financial fraud. For instance, the FTC Consumer Sentinel collects reports, and from those reports determines where to put resources in fighting fraud. So the more they have, for instance, they had a lot of the tax scam reports. They were able to actually successfully locate offenders, some here and some in a foreign country, and were able to prosecute them for their crimes. As I said, full financial recovery is difficult to achieve. We need to tell them that up front. For civil legal action is possible, it may not work. We've got a little section here at the end of the presentation on civil justice for victims of crime, and we're going to hopefully have time to give you a couple examples of when that might be a good action to try to take. We want to let people know that resources definitely are available. There's more out there than they know. And we also want to emphasize that recovery is also about their health, physical health, but also mental health for sure. And lastly, there may be silence. A lot of the places that they report to, there's not going to be a person calling to follow up to let them know what's going on with their case. They may need to do some follow-up, or in some cases, they they submit a report, and that might be the end of the communication for that organization. So we need to let them know when they're reporting. Okay, so now we're getting to the action steps. We did a little, briefly talked about the action steps for advocates, but we're going to move on to action steps for victims based on the 4 different types of fraud, and I'll turn it over to Susan to talk to you all about those.
Thanks, Laura. Certainly our approach with this guide has been to create a more victim-centered approach as you are working with possible victims or your clients. And because what we've learned from that is if victims are involved in their own recovery, in the long run, it will improve both their mental and physical health, and it empowers them so that they can take accountability and hopefully in the long run move them from being under the ether, which translates to that emotional state, to moving back to a rational state where they make more thoughtful decisions about what has happened to them. Because Laura talked a lot about what could happen in terms of being re-victimized, and one aspect of that is, understandably, once you're victimized, you blame yourself, you just remain in that emotional state. So getting the victim involved in their recovery is critical. And of course, first of all, what we would recommend is that the victim discontinue all engagement with the perpetrators with whom they've fallen victim. And then, of course, step 1, create a case file. They should maintain one central file that contains all of the relevant documentation that relates to the specific fraud that they've fallen for. And it's really important for them to maintain so that they can keep it in a secure location. And then, of course, in addition to that, it's important that the victim knows his or her rights. Because victims of various frauds may have rights imparted by federal and, in some cases, state law. And so they need to know their rights to protect themselves. And what we've learned is the State Attorney General's office and or the office of the local prosecutor will likely have staff in your local areas who can help you identify and explain these rights to you. Thirdly, of course, and we've talked about this, but encourage the victim to report the suspected fraud. It's just so important getting down to a local level that law enforcement and local FBI offices, etc., understand what potentially is happening in their communities, because in the long run it will help protect many more people if victims come forward and report what's happened to them. And in the long run, of course, it will help them as well. And then lastly, and Laura will talk about this a little more, but consider civil remedies. And it's important that victims be aware that often the best potential for any recovery of lost assets is through civil suits. And of course, Laura talked earlier about managing expectations. We, of course, would say that no assets are probably going to be recovered, but there is a potential, and NCVC has the National Crime Victim Bar Association that can provide referrals to attorneys for those potential victims. And Laura, as I said, will talk a little more about that. Lastly, we also, in addition to our resource guide, have checklists for that are available at both NCVC and saveandinvest.org website. It says here checklists at saveandinvest.org. These are created by fraud type, and they're a guide to help victims go through what they need to do to help themselves. All right, moving along, let's start looking at a little more closely the different types of broad frauds. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but it does. So, for instance, with identity theft, that is a very large category. But in general, it's the use of a fraudster by taking someone else's personal identity and fraudulently using it to obtain, goods and services. It can be the result of imposter schemes, phishing, data breaches. We're all familiar with the data breaches. What's interesting with identity theft is it was the #1 consumer complaint to the FTC for 15 consecutive years. Now, that time period would be 2000 to 2014. I think since that time, we have identified more specifically the different types of financial fraud that are occurring out there. But it's interesting that this was always at the top of the list, and still the loss of your identity can contribute to so many different types of financial fraud. So moving along, this next chart just shows you how it's increased. It's pretty staggering. Since 2013 just to 2015, it looks like it almost doubled in terms of the number of identity theft complaints that came into the FTC. And then below that is, of course, tax or wage, which are still identity theft complaints. So in terms of what you can do, this slide is very important, and we highly encourage you to recommend this to anybody who's fallen victim to identity theft. The FTC has a great website, identitytheft.gov, and it's pretty much full service in that it's a tremendous plan for an individual to walk through what has happened to them and the steps that a victim needs to take to get their identity back. And in addition to that, the Identity Theft Resource Center has a 24/7 hotline, which is available here, and also is listed in the Taking Action Guide as well. It's a tremendous site, and we highly encourage you to recommend it and use it. So moving along, what can you do to prevent identity theft? I think this first one is really important, especially this day and age with all of the data breaches that seem to continue to occur. I think it's important to assume that all of our information is out there somewhere, whether it be buried in the dark web or it's available in some scammer's hands. So there are some important steps that we all can take to help prevent identity theft, and that's, of course, to shred our important documents and always be aware of who we're giving our personal information to. Specifically, we say here doctor's offices. They require, oftentimes they'll ask for your Social Security. They don't necessarily need to have that. I think when you get older that might change in terms of Medicare, but you don't need to provide your Social Security number at a doctor's office. Very important, this third bullet, to be careful when you use an ATM because of the card skimming machines that could potentially be there, and they could read your card number and watch for your PIN, and then they have access to your money. And then lastly, monitor your credit reports, and even consider putting credit freezes on these different reports. Of course, Experian and TransUnion are two of them. And of course, also go and check annually at annualcreditreport.com. And this is the particular website that's recommended by the federal government, so that's why we include it here. And then specifically, the tax scams, which is as a result of having our personal identification information stolen. In 2016, I think this is very interesting, 400% surge in phishing and malware incidents during the tax season. And so what can you do? I mean, first of all, be aware that the IRS is not going to contact taxpayers by email, text messages, calls, social media channels to request personal or financial information. They're not going to do it. They're going to send you a letter. And what are prevention strategies? File taxes early if you can. And if filing online, make sure you're using a secure network. Don't leave your taxes in your mailbox. Take them to the post office. And work with credible individuals that you have checked out, or potentially work with AARP Tax Aid. So those are just a few steps with the tax scams. And then the next broad category is investment fraud. And what we have listed here are what I would call the more traditional types of investment fraud scams, your advance fee schemes, where they ask for money up front for a particular product to be processed, email intrusions. They potentially could come together. Market manipulation schemes, which we call pump and dump schemes, and that's where you an individual hypes a particular stock and they get you to buy in at a higher amount. This happens an often amount with penny stocks, but as the price goes up, then the person who was trying to sell it pulls out, and then you've lost all of your money. That's why it's called pump and dump. And then Ponzi schemes, of course, we know what that is, and that was Bernie Madoff is the one that we always refer to. But, you know, smaller Ponzi schemes are happening across the country, I would say almost daily. And so it's really very important to understand and to check out an individual before you sign on the dotted line, for sure. And one other thing I'll add about investment fraud scams is these are the what I said, more traditional types of investment fraud scams. But, you know, they can happen with other types of products. For instance, oil and gas scams. We have a couple that we became familiar with in Maine who fell victim to a windmill scam, all investments, because they invested their money in these products. So again, always important, and we'll get into steps that every consumer can take to protect themselves. The next slide is an example of a free dinner seminar. And what you see here is the use of those persuasion tactics I was talking earlier about. You know, complimentary, no cost or obligation. Well, that's reciprocity for you out there who gets this dinner invitation. The phantom riches, eliminate risk. Well, that's definitely a red flag when anything ever says eliminate risk, because when you're dealing with any kind of investment, there is a risk associated with it. Clients never lose. Another thing I'll add in terms of oftentimes if it's a scam, the invitation itself might have misspelled words. It might not be worded properly. It will have a lot of hyped language. So again, this is just an example of what we would call a fraudulent free dinner seminar invitation. So what can you do in terms of investment fraud, in terms of action steps? And first of all, our mantra, as I've said earlier, is ask and check. What we've learned from research is if you are being targeted by a scammer, and you may or may not know that, obviously, you're probably not going to know it, ask lots of questions. And what we've learned from research is the more questions you ask, and if it's fraudulent, that scammer is probably going to walk away from you because they like to maintain control of the conversation. They are fast talkers. They're very clever. So you have to cut them. You have to stop them at their own game and ask lots of questions, then walk away and check out the answers. Check to see that that individual is licensed and that the product is registered. And then in addition to ask and check, and of course different organizations have other mantras that are similar to this. Investigate before you invest. That's another one, just as an example. Also be aware when persuasion is being used on you. And that's why we say learn to spot the red flags of fraud. And it's easy to become immune to it because in our daily lives, persuasion's used a lot, but it's really important to be aware of that whenever it involves our own money. And then, of course, guarantees, risk-free, time pressure, that all rolls into it as well. And always be aware that investments carry risk. So those are just a few items to be aware of as it relates to investment fraud. A couple of resources that FINRA offers that are very valuable. in doing homework is what we call our broker check system. This is a system, anybody selling an investment is required to be registered. And through broker check, first of all, you can check that individual out or the firm that they work for. First of all, if they're not in the system and they're trying to sell you something, that's probably the biggest red flag. But if they are, the information that's available to you is very valuable. It will give you the different licenses that they have to sell the products that they are selling. It will give you their work experience, and we often caution individuals, if a person's moved around a lot, that might be somewhat of a red flag that you need to inquire about. What I think is most important is it says here problems. If there are customer complaints with an individual, that's really very important to know and to pursue further. And you might even find out that a particular person that you're researching has been barred from the industry. All of that is available through Broker Check. This is a free service at FINRA.org, so I highly recommend that you remember this and include this in your work with potential victims of this type of financial fraud. Moving along, another service that we offer I think is very valuable. It's our professional designations tool. Again, this is available at FINRA.org. And this day and age, an individual might give you their business card, and it has an alphabet soup of initials after their name. And who knows what they all mean, right? So you can go to this tool and enter those initials, and hopefully, again, it will come up, and what it will give you is what the letters stand for, who the issuing organization is, what is the experience or educational requirements to get that designation, whether there is a complaint or disciplinary process that is available through that organization, and also, very importantly, whether the designation is accredited by anyone. So this, again, is just a resource that we have developed to help individuals make more thoughtful and wise decisions before they sign on the dotted line. And we have not talked about the SEC. Of course, they are our partner in prevention, a great partner in prevention. And they have a wonderful website as well, investor.gov. Lots of great information. I've talked about checking the person out. You can go to investor.gov to check the product out. And it's available through their Edgar system. And so I highly recommend, and you'll find out all the information about that when you go there. So another great tool to ensure that what you're potentially investing in or a client is legitimate. And I'll hand it back to you, Laura.
Thanks, Susan. So I'm going to move on to mortgage and lending fraud. Basically, it's just when somebody falsifies information to obtain a home loan, or when lenders put something on a document that is false and a person might sign it. And it can come in many forms, including overvalued appraisals, guarantees of low interest rates, inflated income, fraudulent use of someone's name without their permission. We see mortgage and lending fraud in loan modification scams and foreclosure prevention scams, and also things just basically somebody just saying they're going to provide a service and not deliver it, related to an upfront fee, which is paid for a mortgage. Another thing I always like to talk about in this section is payday loans. So they're not fraudulent by definition, but many are predatory, and some are scams targeting low-income consumers. Interest rates for payday loans are often sky high. People are unable to pay them in time, and so they build interest up really quickly, and then providers often use predatory tactics to get people to pay those. And then there are instances where those tactics are illegal and where victims might be able to get out of paying those back if if these tactics are used. We also want to briefly mention reverse mortgages in this section. Reverse mortgages are not fraudulent per se, but just like any other sort of loan, we want to make sure people do their homework before signing off on one. There are a lot of problems that often come up with reverse mortgages, like spending loan proceeds too quickly, default from failure to pay tax and insurance, and surviving spouse evictions. They are a home loan. It is not a government benefit. And I believe those age 62 and up are eligible. So they are ones that may fall into these traps when taking out a home loan. And they just basically should always do their homework before taking out a reverse mortgage. As far as action steps go for mortgage and lending fraud, it's a lot like many other types of fraud as far as focusing on reporting. We want people to report to law enforcement, attorney generals, other agencies. We also want them to treat the fraud as identity theft. They should establish fraud alerts with credit reporting companies, just like you would if you were a victim of identity theft. One of the resources I want to highlight is a mortgage fraud online toolkit. It's something that was created by the National Crime Prevention Council and is available online. It can be a good resource for those who have fallen victim to mortgage fraud. And then one last thing we note on this slide is there's a guide that advises obtaining handwriting samples from both the victim and the perpetrator if possible. Perpetrators, if it's a case where it's a perpetrator that the victim knows, maybe somebody that is available, and you can obtain their handwriting sample. That can be useful in proving that the victim didn't sign any paperwork and that the perpetrator actually did. It's also good to order copies of checks, interview blank clerks, and do a number of things. So that publication, Our Graying Society, Issues of Elder Abuse and Age Bias, is also a helpful resource. Some information about preventing mortgage frauds. Be very suspicious of advance fees. Anybody asking for an advance fee to provide a mortgage or a loan is a big red flag. Also, no doc loans. So somebody offering to provide a loan or a mortgage without requiring documentation. Any good provider is going to want documentation of income and savings and other assets before they're going to give you a mortgage or a loan. You should also verify the licenses and loan professionals. So you should ask them, like the FINRA mantra of ask and check. You should ask them if they're licensed, and then you should always check it. You shouldn't take their word for it. And lastly, the HUD Housing Counselor has a HOPE line at 888-995-HOPE. They are a great resource prior to taking out a mortgage, prior to taking out a reverse mortgage, prior to refinancing. They aren't as helpful after the fact. So they're a good resource that's out there, but they're particularly helpful before you do anything mortgage related and not so much after somebody has fallen victim. And here's the toolkit I mentioned earlier that's published by the National Crime Prevention Council. You can find it online at this link. And I will be providing copies of the slides to attendees after the webinar, so don't worry about writing down all the links. Lastly, we're going to move on to mass marketing fraud. So mass marketing fraud is very broadly defined as the use of false promises of cash prizes, services, goods, in exchange for fees, donations, or purchases. It's perpetrated through a variety of mass marketing, like telephones, emails, pop-up ads, television ads, commercials. So that's kind of how we define it. If it's perpetrated through those things, it can be defined as mass marketing fraud. We have a little note at the bottom about foreign lotteries because that's probably the most well-known type of mass marketing fraud. Foreign lotteries are actually illegal, and participating in those is illegal. So, if you are here in the U.S., you're not legally allowed to participate in foreign lotteries. So a lot of people don't realize when they're getting those mass marketing solicitations for that they won something in a foreign lottery, that actually participating in a legitimate foreign lottery may be illegal. For action, as far as action steps go for mass marketing fraud, it's a lot of filing of complaints, and where you file those complaints depends on exactly what type of mass marketing fraud it was. For general consumer scams, the resources are the Better Business Bureau Scam Tracker, as well as the FTC Consumer Sentinel. And they take reports, they accumulate data, and then they use that data to do investigations. I know the Better Business Bureau does work with law enforcement in trying to address common scams in certain areas. If it's an international fraud, you can report it to the U.S. Department of State. If it's mail fraud, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service has a 24-hour hotline that you can call and report. And if it's a wire transfer or any sort of internet-based crime, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, also known as the IC3, is run by the FBI and will take a report. As far as prevention goes for mass marketing fraud, there's no way to totally stop those fraudulent calls, to stop the fraudulent mail from being sent, but there are ways to kind of cut the clutter down. So with calls, we always tell people don't respond, don't answer the phone. A lot of times they'll have prompts that say press 1 to speak to somebody or press 2 to be removed from this list. They're not going to remove you from the list. They just kind of verify that there's actually a person that owns the phone and they might actually call more. You can set up lots of scam alerts like AARP's Fraud Watch Network and the Better Business Bureau's Scam Tracker. And there's also, to cut the clutter, there's a number of resources that are available. There's call blocking technology through phone service providers, ways to cut down on direct mail and email offers, ways to cut down on credit card offers. You can put yourself in the do not call list or telemarketing calls. And there's a resource for blocking robocalls that has been found to be pretty successful. So we include this picture here to show you what this lottery fraud and other sorts of mass marketing fraud by mail can look like. The U.S. Postal Inspection Service, I think, provided this image, and they do perform mail interdictions and employ phone termination. So if you're dealing with if you're dealing with a victim whose coffee table looks like this one, definitely give the U.S. Postal Inspection Service a call. They may be able to assist. We want to go over a couple top scams from 2017. We're seeing recently online purchase scams increase significantly over the past year, which isn't surprising with how much online shopping people are doing. So we always want to be very careful of what you're buying online and who you're buying it from, and making sure it's from reputable dealers, because a lot of times there may not be, if it's from a website that's maybe a little bit shady or not from, it's just from an individual who is a fraudster, it's really unlikely you're going to be able to get your money back. Investment scams have also risen this year to number 2. Employment scams have increased, and I think, again, with people looking for jobs online, we're seeing lots of fraudulent job offers online. Some are even asking people to pay in order to be interviewed or in order to be considered for a job. I think I've actually gotten a couple of those emails at my work email, which is really interesting. Advance fee loans are the fourth. Fake checks, home improvement scams, and I do think we see a lot of home improvement scams after like natural disasters, like hurricanes, tornadoes, and things like that. So if we have lots of those happening, often we see home improvement scams following the track of a tornado or hurricane, and offering to fix people's properties up afterward and then just leaving without fixing anything and taking some upfront money provided by homeowners. Tech support scams, people hacking into computers and holding them ransom, installing ransomware, malware, and a lot of those will actually ask for Bitcoin in order to release the technology back to the consumer or the victim. Travel, vacation, and vacation scams are a new one here in the top 10, I believe. We're seeing more of those lately with people booking trips online, so a lot of these perpetuated through the internet. The friend and family emergency scams, kind of like Susan talked about earlier with her mom and the grandson needing help ASAP. Those are increasing. And then government grant scams, lastly, are something that I also believe is new to the top 10. This resource is from the Better Business Bureau Scam Tracker. We want to touch on romance scams before we get more toward the end of the information. So the reason I always like to talk about it is because the amount of money lost is so high. So the Internet Crime Complaint Center reported a loss of $197 million from confidence frauds, and that's what they call them, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a romance, it can be a friendship, from confidence frauds in 2015. I think they were increasing. I don't know that they're still increasing, but the amount lost is still very high. So average victim loses over $100,000, which is incredibly devastating to most victims. They did see reports climb from 2014 to 2015, 900 more, and then the amount of loss was 27 million more. So lots of money lost in these scams. For those who are most targeted, it's typically women and men aged 40 and 60, between ages 40 and 60. A couple of tips we want people to remember for handling scam attempts. So it's kind of like spotting those persuasion tactics that Susan talked about earlier. Things you want to think about before you're giving anyone money for any reason, particularly if they're, soliciting you over the phone or online somehow. So ask yourself, if you didn't solicit it, why did it solicit you? Why are you getting this offer of money? Normally, we don't have people offering us money legitimately every day. It just doesn't happen. Number 2, cut the clutter and don't engage. Don't answer those fraudulent calls. Develop a refusal script. This can be helpful if it's something that keeps happening, and if you're dealing with a relative or a family or a friend who might have even fallen victim before. Trying to figure out how to stop the fraud from continuing can be hard, but developing a refusal script can be helpful. So it's something that you say every time you're solicited. Take a timeout. A lot of the scams will say, this is something super urgent. You have to give money right now. You've got to go out right now and buy a green dot card or iTunes gift card or whatever perpetrators are asking for at the moment. But very rarely are you ever going to get a legitimate issue come up where you have to act immediately. You can take a time out, think about it, and do some research before you do anything rash. Be your own devil's advocate. So, ask that question. If you didn't solicit it, why did it solicit you? Make sure you're asking all the questions and searching for those red flags. And then do your research and check independent sources. Lastly, before we get to talk about civil justice a bit, I'm going to talk to you about networking and partnerships. So one of the things that we found is really helpful is developing a multidisciplinary team or a FAST team. Multidisciplinary team is an MDT or a FAST team, financial assistance service team, I believe. I might be getting that acronym wrong, so don't quote me. But those are basically specialized organizations of coalitions who are working together to provide a comprehensive, holistic response to individuals who are falling victim in those areas. And they can consist of many different types of organizations, including attorneys general, state victim crime coalitions, area agencies on aging, better business bureaus, the FCC, CFPB, and other federal agencies. civil attorneys, and also prosecutors, triad, and law enforcement officers. And so now I'm going to turn it over to my coworker, Benjamin McCarty, he's our staff attorney with the National Center for Victims of Crime, with the National Crime Victim Bar Association. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about civil justice and criminal justice, and give a couple examples of when civil justice might be a good option to pursue for victims of financial crime.
All right, so hi everyone, and thank you, Laura, and thank you all for being here with us today. So we've been talking so far a lot about resources and steps available for financial crime from government agencies, but we wanted to make you all aware that communities have to recovery under the criminal justice system as well. And something we like to call criminal justice. There often won't be resources to bring a criminal case. In each incident of financial crime, that even if there is a criminal case, punishment may not be sufficient. So we think this is a great option for you all to consider, and something for you to be aware of when you're talking with these victims. And talking about this, I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. When we're talking about civil justice, we're talking about obviously the civil justice system, and when you compare that to the criminal justice system, there are a couple of differences. And you're probably aware that, with the criminal justice system, the outcome would be a deprivation of liberty, so someone would be either facing some kind of criminal supervision, whether it be going to jail or prison or probation. But with the civil justice system, the outcome is going to be a monetary assessment. So the hope would be that the victim could obtain a monetary assessment. And another difference is that the criminal justice system, the case is initiated by the state or local government, and the state controls the case all the way through. And with the civil justice system, the victim plaintiff initiates the suit, and they, along with their lawyer, would decide all of the details and strategies for the case. So, as with any legal case, some are successful and some are not. With financial crime cases, there has in fact been many successful outcomes. Many of you would probably remember the Bernie Madoff case, for example. There, victims who lost $60,000 or less received 90% of their money back, and those who lost more than $60,000 received 60% of their money back. And there are also, that's one of the more famous examples, but there are also several examples of successful cases brought by attorneys who are members of our National Crime Victim Bar Association at the National Center for Victims of Crime. And in any event, victims should be encouraged to consult with an attorney about pursuing a civil lawsuit, particularly in cases involving investment or mortgage fraud. But as we do, as I mentioned, there are several of our own attorneys who have brought cases, so I'm just going to go over a couple of those examples with you all. In Tennessee, one of our members took a case on behalf of employees working in a country club. And you might be familiar with this, but when you register the name, you always see that service fee charge on your bill, and that is supposed to be used for employees. This country club in Tennessee was taking those service fees and putting them in a fund that was used for various things, which included employee parties at Christmas. And when the company's chief financial officer went on vacation, someone discovered that part of that money that was supposed to go for the service fee was being misused, and the employee reported it. And so employees were able to bring a lawsuit with the help of one of our attorneys against the employer, and they received $3 million in damages. In another case brought by one of our attorneys, a firefighter union president would often take files home to work with him over the weekend, and he, on one occasion, or several occasions, he left the files containing union members' social security and other identifying information in unsecure locations. And because of this, his daughter was able to, or I guess he discovered the files and was able to obtain social security numbers and actually open credit cards in several of the union members, the victims testified that they spent about 40 hours limiting the fraud, so trying to figure out exactly what was a legitimate fund and what wasn't on their credit card statement. And they also experienced embarrassment as a result of this because some of them were able to take out loans and do other things because of the impact on their credit. So in this case, each victim received $270,000. And finally, just so you're aware, fraud cases in particular can have more consequences for victims than just lost finances. One of those consequences could be criminal punishment. Or so victims in one case brought by one of our attorneys, they were notified by their bank that individuals were writing bad checks in their name, and the victims reported the identity theft to the appropriate government agencies, and they also notified or responded to their bank and asked the bank to close their account. Regardless, the victims were later actually arrested for writing bad checks. In the end, the banks were found to be liable as they failed to close the victims' accounts, and the victims did end up receiving $300,000, but they nonetheless face now having an arrest on their records. So those are just a couple of examples of cases. There are obviously a lot more, but those are just ones that we have from our attorneys. And I also wanted to point out, as part of our National Crime Victim Bar Association, we do have a what we call the Attorney Referral Service, which has a national hotline. It is 844-LAW-HELP. And we also have a local District of Columbia line, referral line number, and that's 202-467-8716. So that's definitely, we encourage you all to provide this hotline as a resource. We have almost 400 attorney members around the country who are all very experienced in taking on victim cases, and when people call into the hotline, we have an initial intake team who calls and figures out exactly what happened, and then we attempt to make a referral to one of our attorneys. And then we also encourage you to look at state and local bar associations as a resource to provide to financial crime victims, because they're going to have their own lawyer referral service. And then also doing a little research into other state and local resources like your local legal aid, because sometimes they can help with these situations as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Talking to us a little bit more about civil justice and when it might be a good option. Okay, so getting towards the end, we got a couple of slides to go, but I just wanted to let everybody know that if they have questions, that there's a Q&A box. It should be in the bottom right hand of their screen. You can go ahead and type any questions you have there, and we should have time to go over them with you guys. So a couple additional resources that are newer, that they all have been included in our updated version of the guide. It's the U.S. Senate Aging Committee's Anti-Fraud Hotline, the Victim Connect Resource Center, 1-855-4-VICTIM. I think I talked about it a little bit earlier. It's something we have here in our office, and they provide resources and referrals to crime victims of any type, including victims of financial crime. The CFPB also has great resources for managing somebody else's money, and they are specified depending on the relationship to the person, so guardians, powers of attorney, and things like that. And then lastly, the FINRA has a securities helpline for seniors that people can call if they have securities or investment questions or need help with a fraud. People can also call if they have other types of issues, and the helpline will try to get them to where they need to be. And so I'll turn it back over to Susan to talk a little bit about some additional resources, and we'll get to questions in a minute.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And we do encourage you to use the toll-free number that Laura referred to that FINRA has available, and because it launched several years ago, and through the process of individuals calling, we've saved close to $10 million for folks. So It's a toll-free number. You can be anonymous. We highly encourage you to use it and share it with your communities. In addition to the toll-free number, we have just a wide variety of free resources that we would love to make available to you or to anyone else with whom you work that conducts community outreach or might find this information available. The best way to understand what we have available is to go to our free materials portal. And yes, I said free, and you can order up to 200 items for each item, up to 200, and we will mail it to you at no cost. And the best way to get there is to go to saveandinvest.org, and then the tab that says Protect Your Money. Just go to the bottom of that, and that's where you'll find the free materials portal, or you can Google it. So we have just a wide variety of materials. Fighting Fraud 101, the Taking Action Resource Guide. In addition to that, I would encourage you, when you visit saveandinvest.org, at the top right-hand corner you can sign up for free investor alerts. And we don't try to pummel you with emails, but we do want to keep you informed of what's happening in the industry as it relates to different types of financial fraud. And we always include steps you can take, organizations that are available to you. So again, great materials, all free and available for you. The documentaries that I referred to, we even have a video game. Yes, it's called Con 'em If You Can, one word, and it's available in both Apple and Google stores to download, or at Con 'em If You Can, one word, online. So please take advantage of these free resources. And I think the last slide just encourages you to order more of these Taking Action guides. We want to make them available to you and to your colleagues as well. So please order. The second edition just came out, and so we'd love to put that in your hands if you're interested. And I think that brings us to the end of the webinar, so I'll hand it back to Laura, and would love to hear if you have any questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Susan. So we do have two questions so far. The first is, what makes victims of domestic violence at a higher risk of financial fraud? It's a great question. And there's, being that we work at the National Center for Victims of Crime, we see lots of intersectionality between different types of crimes, and domestic violence and financial fraud is a big one. This is mostly because domestic violence is all about exerting power and control over victims. So often perpetrators will do that in any way possible, whether it's emotional abuse, physical abuse, or financial abuse. And so a lot of perpetrators will do things like destroying a victim's credit so that they can't leave the relationship. Will use their credit cards, personal identifying information without their knowledge, putting them in debt. It's just basically further disabling that person to prevent them from leaving the relationship and further exerting that power and control. So hopefully that's helpful. There's lots of information out there about economic abuse. And I encourage you, if you work with domestic violence victims, to look into that and look more into this intersectionality. The second question was, how can people block or stop getting solicitations from marketing? That would be the best tip. So I don't know if this was asked before or after we did this mass marketing prevention slide, but I pulled it back up for you. There are ways to cut the clutter, as we talked about, but they're not going to totally stop it. There's no way to totally stop mail from coming. There's no way to totally stop this spam solicitations from coming. So there are ways you can cut it down. There's probably no way to completely stop it. Hopefully these resources help, and I do believe there are other resources out there. One thing I will say, be careful before paying for any of these resources. Some may be legitimate and may be worth paying for, but others might be fraud. So you just want to be careful before you pay for any sort of service that's going to promise to stop the calls and solicitations from coming through. So someone asked if we could get a brief summary of the civil justice portion. It was a bit muffled. I'm sorry about the sound issues there, but yes, we can definitely provide that for you. What I can do is I'll add a couple additional slides to this PowerPoint with that information, and when we distribute it, it'll be in the presentation for you all. All right, so I don't see any additional questions, but if you do have questions, oh, let's see, one more did just come in. Do you have any specific safety planning tips for when working with victims of domestic violence? I don't have any off the top of my head that I know of, but what I do know that's the safety planning information is out there. I believe the best resource to start with is the OVC website. So the Office for Victims of Crime has lots of resources developed through many, many, many grant projects that they've done, and they have a lot of resources available. I'm fairly certain they have something specifically on safety planning. So I'm not sure if it's on the OVC website or if it's on their training and technical assistance called the TTAC page, but I do believe it's on there somewhere. If you can't find it, go ahead and send me an email and pull my email up. At the end, I will find it and I can send it to you. Let's see. Do you have a sample refusal script for seniors? This is another thing that I don't have available. I don't have right at my fingertips, but I know those are out there. I've seen them. We don't have any included specifically in our guide, but it's another thing I can try to find for you. If you want to send me an email afterward, that would be helpful. Go ahead and I will try to find one and send it to you. A couple people asking about certificates. I can give you a certificate of attendance as well. Again, so if you wouldn't mind sending me an email. So my email is lcook@victimsofcrime.org for anyone who can't see. And I can send you a certificate of attendance. Okay, lots of questions coming in now. Any specific tips for dealing with victims with diminished capacity? That's a really, really tough one. Those situations are very delicate, and you can't take a person's, you really can't tell a person that they can no longer make financial decisions for themselves unless they are truly incapacitated and you've been able to get power of attorney or something over their finances. So probably, I mean, if you're dealing with somebody with diminished capacity who's experiencing a financial fraud, I would advise calling Adult Protective Services. There may be resources and additional help that they specifically can provide. And there are ways, there are things that you can do to try to help without totally taking away that person's control over their finances. Like just being a little bit more active in, asking them what they're doing with their money. I don't want to say monitoring a person's phone calls, but trying to help them not answer solicitations as much as you can, getting rid of mail that includes solicitations. Without knowing more about the specific type of fraud, I don't know exactly what would be best, but I do think calling APS is key. And then also remembering that until a doctor and somebody, a reputable doctor, not just anybody, has said that this person is suffering from significant capacity issues, that you can't just try to take away their control over their finances. It could actually make the situation worse. And Susan, feel free to chime in if you know of things that I'm missing. Okay, next question. When ordering your credit report from the 3 agencies, is it best to order them sporadically? For instance, doing Experian in January, Equifax in May, TransUnion in September, to monitor credit throughout the year. So I believe now you can monitor this for free. There have been some new changes in the law, and I apologize, I'm not 100% sure of when those go into effect and what exactly it means for consumers. But I know that they're requiring credit reporting agencies to provide more to people for free, so not charging people for everything.
Laura, I think...
Go ahead, Susan.
Laura, you here?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the credit freeze used to cost by state, but now my understanding is that all of those costs have been removed, and you can freeze your credit for free.
And Susan, so this person asked, is it better to check it sporadically? Because I think sometimes people might, if you get dinged, if you check your credit too often, it might actually negatively impact your credit if you're checking it all the time. Do you think it's better to do it sporadically?
You know, I don't know that. I think if you could check it every 6 months, I don't think in the long run that works against you. I think that might be somewhat misleading. There's no reason why if you check your credit that it should work against you.
Okay.
And also, I was going to add for the previous item, I had myself on mute, so sorry. But one individual added that local law enforcement agencies sometimes have provide safety planning help. And I think that's important to remember if you have questions or need help. And then you already mentioned APS, so they can help as well. APS workers are great.
All righty. And we have, I think, one question left. Any experience with the new trend among states to use undue influence as an element of financial crimes against elders? Personal experience, no, but I do know it's something that people have been pushing for a very long time, because elder financial exploitation doesn't always fit very neatly into traditional types of crime that are prosecuted. So in a lot of states, there's actually not separate statutes for prosecuting elder financial exploitation. Often it's prosecuted under things like theft or conversion or things like that. And it may not be as easy because it's not simply theft or conversion. It can be a lot more complicated than that. And like I said earlier, I kind of talked about people participating in their own recovery. Typically, with theft and similar statutes, it requires people to not be participating. Whereas elder financial exploitation, victims are often aware it's happening, but aren't aware it's exploitive. And so I feel like that undue influence, that addition to statutes is probably a good thing, albeit it can be confusing. We did some work on a civil statute for elder financial exploitation and went back and forth a lot with trying to determine whether we should include language about undue exploitation in our civil statute. And what we decided to do ultimately in our model civil statute. And what we decided to do in this model was to tell any readers to refer to their other statutes that are existing on undue influence, because all states approach it differently, and we didn't want to have something as, this is the model and this is what should be used. If a state already has something on the books, it could be confusing. So it can be a little bit difficult to understand exactly what undue influence means and what it means based on how the statute is written. That's often where it's a little bit difficult. It's difficult to say when exactly undue influence is playing a part in the financial exploitation, but in my opinion, it's probably a good thing that that's being added because of the complexities of financial exploitation and how it's just that undue influence that addition might make or break a case that addition may help get a guilty verdict, where a statute without it might not be criminal, unfortunately. It's a very long answer to a short question, but I hope that information was helpful. Okay, well, I don't think we have any other questions left, but if we do, and we are getting down to the end, so if you do, please feel free to email myself or Susan or both of us. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. I'll let you guys know about certificates, and I can answer other specific questions we talked about. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for participating in the webinar. We really appreciate it, and yeah, we'll hopefully be in touch. Good luck fraud fighting, and have a great day.